Hey everybody, it's Wes, and if you haven't noticed already, the channel recently hit 15,000 subscribers, and that's kind of just insane to say out loud, Whether you've been here since the early videos or just found the channel recently, every single view, comment, and discussion that we've all had over the last few years has helped build this into something way bigger than I ever expected. And as my way of saying thank you, I wanted to do something a little bit different and answer any questions that you guys had about Halo. And I'll tell you what, you all did your part. I've picked about 20 of them here, and I will be covering topics like the Swords of Sanghelios, whether or not the Master Chief is still the future of Halo, and some of the universe's biggest plot holes. Now, some of these answers are going to get pretty in-depth and be more of a full breakdown of your question, while others are going to be a little bit more off the cuff. Just me giving you my honest thoughts and opinions. So whether you're here for the deeper lore, the theories, or you just want to hear me ramble for a little bit about the games, there's probably something in here for you. And again, thank you all so much for 15,000 subscribers. I can't thank you all enough, but I think by the time this video comes out, we may have hit another milestone. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into your questions. All right, our first question of today is coming from PRTFDC2, and what they asked was, I found a short talking about if the UNSC found the Brutes before the Covenant did, and I was wondering what your take on it would be. So if I'm not mistaken, I think the video you're talking about here is from Chance, who makes fantastic shorts and also does long-form content as well. But for those of you who haven't seen this specific video, he highlights two scenarios for if humanity stumbled upon the Jiralhane before the Covenant did. One being that we would have a diplomatic relationship with them, and the second being if they lashed out against us, which obviously results in a conflict. He goes a little bit further exploring what that outcome of that conflict would be, depending on if they were found before or after the Great Immolation, which, if you didn't know, was essentially a worldwide nuclear conflict that sent the Brutes back to the Stone Age. For my take, though, I'm just going to say the UNSC finds them at roughly the same time the Covenant did, so we're talking about a species with no advanced technology or weapons. And even though the humans are incredibly small in comparison to the Brutes, and we're not as technologically advanced as the Covenant, I still think there would be some sort of reverence that the Jiralhane would have towards them for their futuristic tech and space vessels, mirroring how when the Covenant arrived, the younger generation of Brutes were accepting of the Covenant's ways in hopes of elevating their species to a greater status again. Now, the Covenant did also have a religious element as well, and the hierarchical structure of the military made it easier for them to be sort of indoctrinated into blindly following the word of the prophets and being subservient to the Sangheli for a time, obviously, but I think in some way they would at least be willing to collaborate with humans to gain access to our tech or weaponry. Until that point, or until something changes, private human corporations or even Oni would probably want to capitalize on their species, sort of like we see in the post-war era where there's cross-species black market deals and a weapons trade. Humans would probably want unique resources, items of cultural significance, biological data, or even just unrestricted access to develop or research their homeworld of Doizak. The Brutes are also these giant, strong, monkey bear humanoids, so they could probably be brought into the UNSC for some sort of specialized military group, or even be offered contract work as mercenaries as well. But if things did immediately go south and they chose violence over diplomacy, which I think isn't totally out of the picture, as you know they're the Brutes, I have to agree with Chance and say that I'm betting the UNSC wins that fight. The time period is supposedly in the late 2400s, pushing the 2500s, so humanity has already colonized numerous worlds and systems and has a whole arsenal of weaponry that they could use, both planet-side and from orbit. And because the Jiralhane are just limited to their planet, they can't really put up a fight outside of ground engagements, and they can't really retreat to anywhere else. So in theory, the UNSC could just nuke the main areas of resistance or fire a few MAC rounds at the surface. Now, whether or not the Brutes would submit to human superiority is unclear, but humanity would probably push them to a breaking point, which would end with us getting really whatever we wanted out of their species. Now, that was just my take, but if you guys want to let me know what you think in the comments, that would be fantastic. And I'm going to go ahead and put a link to Chance's original video in the description. Be sure to check it out if you haven't already. Next question here is from Mega D-Man 16. Please talk about neural physics and precursor technology and how it compares to the Forerunners. So, neurophysics and precursor technology is a very difficult subject to talk about, not just because it's this weird space magic theoretical science in the real world, but also because in the Halo universe, it is also this weird space magic-y science. It goes way past what we understand about physics and reality, and no species in the ancient past or even present has really matched the precursors' level of tech. With that said, though, the Forerunners are probably the closest to have ever grasped or really understood what neurophysics even was, theorizing that it was based on the fundamental forces by which the universe operates. And with that, based on the teachings of the Mantle, they believed that the universe itself was actually a living entity which flourished from the collective experiences of all beings living within it. The precursors somehow mastered this neurophysical energy or had some sort of connection to this entity, which allowed them to create practically indestructible structures, the galaxy-spanning star roads, as well as travel through space at subluminal speeds. It is also conventionally assumed that this connection allowed them to create and access the domain and allowed them to transcend the limitations of the physical universe, capable of reshaping their forms at will or even being able to exist after their physical bodies were destroyed. I'm sure that was a lot to process, but to kind of dumb it down, in Halo, the Forerunners were considered a Tier 1 builder civilization, being a species who could manipulate gravity, create AI with full sentience, perform super accurate slipspace navigation, and even had the ability to create life or entire worlds. Probably the highest attainable status that a species could strive for. Now, the precursors were actually considered a Tier 0 transsentient civilization, being a step so far above, capable of traveling between galaxies and somehow accelerating the evolution of intelligent life. And of course, they also had the mastery of neurophysics. So, to come back to the question, the Forerunners were incredibly advanced, way more than modern humans, that's for sure, but when it comes to the precursors, Forerunner tech really doesn't come close. Alright, next one here is from Apple27Out, and they said, I'd like to ask, did the Forerunners have the right to regress humanity after their defeat, and by doing that, did it break the mantle of responsibility in any way? I'm going to sound a little bit like Cammy Shep here, but this is actually a fantastic question, primarily because I don't know if I've ever actually seen someone ask it. But to be really direct, I think the Forerunners had no right to regress or devolve humanity, and I definitely think that in some way it had to have violated the mantle of responsibility. Now, just as a little refresher and drastic oversimplification, in ancient times there were two groups that controlled most of the galaxy: the Forerunners and the alliance between ancient humanity and the Sanghelios. They didn't really like each other, but there was this tenuous peace between the two, and they pretty much stayed out of each other's way. But at some point over 100,000 years ago, our ancestors found remains of the precursors and thought it would be a good idea to feed it to their pets. Then, after many generations, these pets got sick and started developing growths. They started eating each other, people got sick, people started eating people, and then the parasitic life form that we know as the Flood began to take shape. It spread across the galaxy like wildfire and eventually made its way to Forerunner-controlled space. Ancient humanity, or the ancestors, then decided to launch an attack to stop the Flood from spreading further, and the Forerunners misinterpreted this as humanity expanding into the Ecumene. Then, after many years of fighting a two-sided war against the Flood and the Forerunners, humanity ultimately lost and was de-evolved as reparations. Now, back to the question. Did the Forerunners have any right to devolve humanity? No, God no. It would be one thing to restrict their travel in space like they did with the Sanghelios, who betrayed us, by the way, and abandoned us during the conflict, but devolving the ancestors was crazy. And worst of all, that wasn't even it. They got rid of all of their technology, experimented on them like crazy, and then gave them geisha that essentially made them subservient to them. And then to make matters even worse, in Halotopomancy, it was revealed through a vision given to an Oni researcher that even after ancient humanity tried to alert them to the presence of the Flood and their true nature, the Forerunners were unwilling to listen, instead accusing them of creating the shaping sickness, which they assumed was a type of bioweapon. In all fairness, they had every right to make that assumption and question what was going on, but their lack of response, or at least willingness to work with humanity to try and remedy it, may have been the moment that they lost any credibility in saying that they didn't know how dangerous the Flood was. Now, as to whether or not it goes against the mantle, I think it really comes down to your interpretation, which for the Forerunners is literally whatever they want, or whatever is the most appropriate for the time. But if you're asking me, I think it does. because they didn't just stop pushing humanity when the war was over. They quite literally erased all traces of their culture, history, technology, really their existence, and then essentially treated them like animals incapable of making any decisions for themselves. And if the mantle asks that the species who holds it protects and nurtures the galaxy's species, I really don't know how cultural genocide and subjugating your enemies does that. But when you look at the long history of the Forerunners, that's probably just another Tuesday. Alright, and on to the next question here from rollpoke-v-viv, and their question was, what time is it?
Pizza time.
Alright, the next question here comes from Fallen Orion, who asks, would it be the end of everything if a Spartan got infected? The things it would know. So I've actually covered topics like Emergency Contact Protocol Upsilon and Corruptor Protocol in some previous videos, which are essentially the UNSC's responses to the flood or the infection of a Spartan. These were introduced in the Spartan Field Manual way back in the day, but in the past few years, we've actually gotten a set of stories that depicted these very events occurring, with those being the Waypoint Chronicles, Saturn devouring his son, and its sequel, Ascension on Atropos. Now, spoilers here, the Spartan's infection that happened at Site-22 really didn't have that big of ramifications, as it and the eventual outbreak were marooned on the backwater planet of Atropos with no means of getting off-world. But if we were to assess the damage of this event, the infected Spartan probably killed a handful of UNSC personnel and miners who were in the battle, and then the Flood gained access to whatever information or knowledge that specific Spartan had as the average Spartan 4. Although it is important to note that he was also part of a team of Spartans specifically trained to fight outbreaks, so the Flood definitely learned about the simulations used to train UNSC personnel, not just Spartans, to combat the parasite. There is also a chance that this specific Spartan knew other classified information, like the locations of key planets, people of strategic importance, UNSC strongholds, etc. But his specialized work on Fireteam Leviathan doesn't necessarily mean he knows anything more than any other high-level non-Spartan personnel. When it comes to the other Spartan generations, though, there could be varying levels of problems that come with their minds being compromised, whether they be Spartan 2s, Spartan 3s, or even one of the original Orion candidates. The danger of their infection really just comes down to whatever it is that they had enough clearance to know. And I understand that over the years there's been a growing sentiment, or rather a huge fear, of Spartans getting infected because of their classified knowledge that they may or may not have, depending on who they are. But in my opinion, I don't really know how that would be any more of a threat than if Captain Lasky, Catherine Halsey, Admiral Hood, or hell, even when Captain Keyes was infected. Instead, I think the biggest threat that a Spartan's infection actually poses is that one of humanity's most skilled soldiers, augmented and in Mjolnir, I might add, would now be under the Flood's control. But that's just me. Let me know what you guys think. Next question here is from Daniel Schuster 2154, who asked, is there any lore about the Forerunner ship buried underneath Sword Base in Halo Reach? So I actually had to do a little bit of research about this one, because I didn't actually realize it had any lore, but the Forerunner ship that you're referring to is known as the Bavtkatha Ice Shelf Forerunner vessel. And I'm not surprised I didn't know anything, because there's actually not a whole lot of information on it, but thanks to our friends over at Halopedia, here's what we know. The vessel is only partially visible, as the majority of it is still hidden within the ice. I'm sure you could have figured that out for yourself, but it is described as being disc-shaped, meaning it doesn't match any other known class of Forerunner ships. Excavation of it began in summer of 2552, after Oni had discovered a number of artifact sites leading from the region where Sword Base is located to Castle Base, which is also the site of the Forerunner Menakite portal complex. Research indicates that the ship may have been outbound but crashed down into the ice shelf around the year of 97,445 BCE, or around the time that the Halo array was fired. And as we saw in Halo Reach, the ship is known to have a holographic data terminal, which became a point of great interest and personal project to Dr. Catherine Halsey. But by the time the Covenant arrived at the planet in August 2552, she had only decrypted a fraction of the data within, whom she had been using the smart AI Cortana to help process. The most important of these findings was actually something she referred to as a latchkey discovery, an advancement relative to the creation of the conical bullet, or slip space technology. And this, of course, was the navigational coordinates to Alpha Halo, though at the time they didn't actually know what the coordinates led to, which is why in Halo CE they say that they made a blind jump. And while it's not necessarily about the ship itself, it is known that after the Human Covenant War, the Mjolnir Gen 2 Starfire visor was created, with its infrastructure being developed from some of that decrypted data originally extracted from the vessel. Next question here is from JoJo Reference. I hope I got that right. Or maybe it's J0J0 Reference. Who knows? But they asked, are there any major plot holes in the games or books? And in your opinion, what is the worst one? I used to think High Charity's arrival at the Ark was a plot hole, but apparently that's been answered in a Waypoint article. If you're asking me, the biggest plot hole in Halo is Flood spores. Hands down, they're probably the most confusing thing about the Flood and are easily the most inconsistent aspect of the franchise, both in terms of how they're depicted in the games and in other expanded media. That's a topic for another day, but for your plot hole though, I'm not really sure which article that would have answered this, but the encyclopedias and Halo Warfleet have really helped in making this make sense over the years. And I'm not exactly sure where the misconception that the Dreadnought was the only thing powering High Charity systems came from, but it is understandable because the Forerunner ship has been noted numerous times to be the primary source of power and has been for many, many years. But before the Dreadnought was planted at the center of High Charity, the megastructure was receiving power from a network of massive pinch fusion reactors hidden in a region known as the Founts. Once in place though, the Dreadnought supplied more than enough power, so these reactors became more of a secondary source. And as High Charity continued to grow over the millennia, these reactors would become less and less viable, really only generating enough output to power the station's slipspace engines. But it's because of these secondary reactors that when Truth fled with the Anodyne Spirit, High Charity was able to make it to the Ark. That and because when the Flood took over, they were able to use their millions upon millions of years of collective Flood and precursor knowledge to fine-tune High Charity's navigational and slipspace systems. And if you really want to nitpick and get into the details, with pretty much every other living being on board having been converted into flood forms or biomass, the gravity generators, life support, lighting, and all otherwise necessary systems needed for living beings would have been turned off at this point, meaning all auxiliary power was being allocated to exactly where it was needed. Next question here comes from Epion-QR4LH. Hope I pronounced that right, but their question was, will there be new and updated terminals in the new Halo remake? And I see all those exclamation marks. I probably should have said that with more emphasis, but yes, it was actually confirmed by none other than Jeff Easterling himself during the 2025 Cannon Fodder Live that they are going to be adding some hidden text terminals to the game. The fact he specified that they are going to be text terminals might mean that they're going to be presented in a similar fashion to how Halo 3's were. Whether that means they're going to be these big bulky Forerunner terminals or those TACPad devices that we saw in Halo Infinite, I couldn't tell you. But seeing as the cinematic terminals from Halo CE Anniversary were primarily from the perspective of 343 Guilty Spark, I wonder if these would actually be told from the perspective of a different character, maybe even multiple. Possibly a member of Fireteam Raven, Antonio Silva, Melissa McKay, Captain Keyes, Zuka Zamami, or hell, even from a Forerunner life worker, who's to say? Either way, I'm sure they're going to be great. I'm sure it's going to be some pretty interesting new additions, but I am looking forward to what is in store. Next question here comes from Colonel Havco9508, who asked, will the ODSTs make a return in any future Halo games? I'm going to go ahead and say yes, or at least I have faith that we will in some way see the ODSTs return in the not so distant future. I actually covered most of their lore and history back in September of 2025, and during that I talked about how I do think the ODSTs still have a place in the Halo universe, even with all of these Spartan 4s present. And while there's no concrete proof that I can give you that confirms they will return in one of the next games, it was teased at the very end of Halo Edge of Dawn that there are dozens of human holdouts across Zeta Halo. And among the human survivors who are at these locations, there were ODSTs mentioned as being present. And that's not even including the two troopers Hightower and Gainey who were accompanying Chief, Joy, Esparza, and all of the others who are at Lifeworker Central. So I'm relatively confident that if Halo 7 is still set on Zeta Halo, and we have a similar style of campaign to Halo Infinite, we'll probably be running around the ring trying to re-establish contact with all of these other survivors, meaning that in at least one of these missions, we'll probably see some ODSTs, or hopefully. There is also the possibility that reinforcements do arrive at Zeta Halo, in line with how it was revealed that a distress signal was received by the Swords of Sanghelios with the ring's coordinates. So actually we may get to see some Helljumpers make a drop from orbit, but we're just going to have to wait and see. This next one comes from Daniel Fabro 822, who asked, Lore of the Hellbringers, please. You betcha, and hey, thank you so much for saying please. It goes a long way. The Hellbringers, also known as the Special Tactics and Equipments Group, are personnel from the UNSC's Orbital Drop Shock Troopers branch who specialize in demolitions and the use of incendiary thermobaric, energetic, chemical, and biological weapons. They are sometimes deployed with demolition charges or sub-tactical nuclear devices to help eliminate heavily entrenched hostiles, but are most commonly seen using several NA-4 defoliant projector flamethrower variants. These troopers are also outfitted with a flame-retardant power exoskeleton that comes with a cylindrical tank on its back for the storage of their weapons' fuel. The Hellbringers are known to have been active throughout the entirety of the Human Covenant War, but their organization and deployment history is largely unknown. The entirety of what we know about them really only comes from the Firestorm Battle Group, who were originally stationed aboard the UNSC Spirit of Fire in 2531. The group has been deployed numerous times over the years, with various operations on Harvest, Trove, and later the Ark, all while under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Morgan Kinsano. And in addition to her specialized Hrunting Mark III Cyclops model, the group also employs a similar variant of the Cyclops called the Incinerator, as well as the M12F Flame Warthog, which can be outfitted with either a mounted flamethrower or incendiary grenade launcher. The Firestorm Battle Group has also seen the addition of experimental, cryogenics-based M7057 flamethrowers added to their arsenal, with this weapon being the result of a theoretical design made by the Spirit of Fire's AI Serena before she decommissioned herself in the early years of the ship's slow drift. Hey everybody, quick note from past Wes here, not future Wes, as I'm getting a little bit tired, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording here, and I'll pick it up tomorrow, but I've got a little bit of a sinus thing going on, so hopefully I wake up tomorrow and don't sound as stuffed up as I am right now, but okay, future Wes, take it away. Next up, we have a question from Lost in Translation 224, who asked, what do you think the way forward for Halo is, and if you were to guess what the next steps in the story would be, what would you say they are, and do you think that they need to keep the Master Chief as the main character, or should they branch out? So I actually think there's two really good questions here, especially because there's been a lot of developments happening in terms of who Halo's next big bad could be and where it is exactly that things could go. But when I try and look for any indication of what the future of Halo may hold, I always come back to the final cutscene of Halo Reach. This is the farthest known point in the Halo universe, which depicts the planet as having been deglassed and recolonized by the year of 2589. Now that doesn't really tell us a whole lot about the actual state of the galaxy, but it does tell us that at the very least, humanity has survived whatever conflicts are in store for us in the next few decades, which Halo Infinite seems to hint would be with groups like the Banished, the Endless, and potentially the Covenant Remnant faction called the Order of Restoration, who, in the novel Halo Empty Throne, seem to be plotting to revive the Covenant Empire to its former glory. Whether or not we have another galactic war against any of these specific groups is up in the air, but I would think that there might be some more isolated conflicts, kind of like we saw with the Battle of Earth in 2559 and the Zeta Halo conflict. But at the very least, I think that the story of the next game is probably going to pit us against the Endless, who Atriox seems to have freed at some point following our fight at the Silent Auditorium. They'll probably break off from whatever remains of the Banished, and like I talked about in my breakdown of Halo Edge of Dawn, go on to try and reset the galaxy and wipe out all intelligent life to restore balance to living time. That may mean they work with the Flood, since they do have some sort of connection to the Precursors, to what extent we don't know, but it may also mean that they'll activate Precursor technology, which prompts the return of some other characters from the lore, like Abaddon, Mendicant Bias, or maybe even some Forerunners, who knows. But if it isn't the Endless who takes center stage, it's probably going to be this Order of Restoration, because the Banished more or less seem like they're kind of on their way out. You know, Chief just literally killed thousands of Banished who were still on Zeta Halo, and pretty much every other single replacement that could have been for Escharum, with the exception of Jaga Erdamni and Atriox himself, but almost all of the other leadership is either dead or missing. Whatever forces that are still alive may still play a role in the story, with someone like Jaga or Atriox popping back up to impede the player's actions, but I think for the most part, Halo is probably going back to its roots, and will reintroduce a more Covenant-level threat. When it comes to whether or not I think the Master Chief should continue to be the main character, I hope so, but he doesn't really need to be. You know, Master Chief being a Spartan 2 means that he could stay in action really for as long as he wants, with his original augmentations and anything else that he's received in recent years, meaning he is at the peak of human biology. And if Sergeant Johnson is any example, even with his Orion augmentations, he was able to remain in active service until the age of 78, Granted, he spent some time in cryo over the years, so his biological age could be slightly off, but this guy didn't even have Mjolnir and was still going toe-to-toe with characters like the Arbiter, Tartarus, and so on. With all of that said, though, I do feel like it would be okay for Halo Studios to branch out to another character, and these future titles could still feel like Halo. Halo 5 is an example of a game that wasn't necessarily received well because Chief wasn't the main character, but I think a lot of that bad blood comes from the fact that you could actually play him and Blue Team, but they were really only second fiddle to Fireteam Osiris, making you feel like Chief was being pushed out while they were actively trying to force you to like this other Spartan team, who for all intents and purposes were really not that bad, just probably not fully developed. And I've talked before about how I don't hate that they experimented with the story presentation and introducing new characters and factions or any of the other many things that I liked about the game, but I just feel like the marketing, the writing, and the flip-flopping are what makes most people hate the attempt of introducing other main characters. But when you look at the spin-offs, like the Halo Wars games, ODST, Halo Reach, they still felt like Halo games and their main characters were strong additions to the franchise. And let's be real, John 117 has been fighting since he was a child, and he hasn't ever stopped. And I don't think he really would want to, but there is going to be a point when his voice actor, Steve Downes, maybe wants to take a step back or just can't perform at the same level he has for over 2 decades. You know, 343 tried to replace him in Halo 4, and obviously that just wasn't going to work, but ultimately the character should probably be retired or maybe become more of a background figure in the future, making occasional cameos. And I absolutely love Steve. He's my idol for his radio and voice acting career, and I'm pretty sure that he said that he wants to voice Chief, forever, but I don't want what happened with Peter Cullen and Optimus Prime to happen to him and Chief. That's probably not going to happen anytime soon, but there's definitely room for characters like a Jerome, another Noble 6, Alpha 9, or even a non-Spartan character to sort of take the reins and still deliver Halo stories that we could all get behind. So while I don't necessarily want them to branch out, I do think that we should all be open to that because it might be the best thing for the legacy of the character. Next question here comes from a person, 3996, who asked, would you consider the Swords of Sanghelios to be a minor faction of the elites or like the faction of the elites, given that they now basically have control of their homeworld and most of their inner systems? So the Swords of Sanghelios are actually one of the bigger remnant factions in the post-war era, and seeing that they essentially wiped out the Storm Covenant in the Battle of Sunayon, they very well may be the faction for the elites. But of course they do also have Ungoi, Kigyar, and Lekgolo bolstering their numbers, and actively collaborate with humanity in a number of endeavors. And while they do largely have control of Sanghelios after several years of non-stop civil war and disagreement on how they move forward as a species, they are constantly being undermined by a handful of other remnant factions. The Banished being their biggest problem at the moment, as the Arbiter himself has said he is concerned over the fact that more and more Sangheli leaders are defecting to the mercenary group, which is why they're losing ground on worlds like Suban. But in all honesty, like I've talked about previously, I think the Banished are sort of in tatters anyway, with most of their notable leadership having either been killed recently or being MIA. So I would say their biggest competition moving forward is actually going to be this newly revamped Order of Restoration, led by the ancient Sanchayum Dovonesto, who just absorbed another remnant faction, Salinion's Covenant. The biggest thing with this faction, though, is that it is being led by a Sanchayum who was allegedly present at the time of its inception and secretly pulled the strings from the shadows over the millennia. So while the Swords may be currently the most prominent remnant group, there is a real possibility that a huge number of Sangheli will abandon the Swords in search of familiarity and renewed purpose that the Order would probably provide. Next up, we have a question from Banished Legion 7383 who asked, are the cut Halo 2 Alien Trooper and Halo Combat Evolved Stalker Covenant species canon? So there's not a lot of information that is known for sure when it comes to these cut enemies, but there are a handful of other similar enemies who have evolved into something that has found its place in Halo lore in recent years. Now, when it comes to the Alien Troopers, Halo CE's art director Marcus Leto himself has said that they were going to be a type of sniper unit and had actually gotten to the texturing stage before being cut altogether. The Stalker was in a similar boat, but didn't really go past the concept stage, having been intended to be a pet to the Covenant Masters, an early iteration of the Sangheli. They also would have worn a collar that could be broken, which would cause them to turn against their handlers. But like I said, both the Stalker and Alien Trooper never really made it to being fully realized, so they're not canon. That's not to say it's impossible for that to change, as the cut enemies, the slugmen, and even the Covenant Masters were canonized in recent years, though I will specify that the Masters were canonized as the appearance of the ancient anti-Covenant leader Usozelis, and the slugmen as an extremely rare gestalt of Lekgolo, who seemingly died off during the fall of High Charity. So if you're really holding out for it, just have hope. The next question here comes from Common Halo, who asked, how connected are the Spartans who are stationed with the Swords of Sanghelios to Sangheli culture and society? There's actually a lot of Spartans who have worked closely with Swords personnel in recent years. These could range from the guys and girls stationed aboard the UNSC Infinity, as there was a handful of Swords on the ship, the ones within the Anvil Initiative who have been working together really since the end of the Covenant War, or someone like Olympia Vale, who is deeply immersed in Sangheli affairs, as she was once a human diplomat and now works directly alongside the Arbiter himself. Most of the UNSC's personnel might also know bits and pieces about Sangheli culture out of the sentiment of know thy enemy, as they were engaged in a decades-long genocide with humans, but I would say human knowledge would have been very limited until the years following the war's end. I'm sure the UNSC or Spartan branch also has some sort of orientation course during training to go over the Sangheli species, just like any other race, but I'm sure the close proximity to Swords personnel comes with the benefit of getting first-hand stories or insight. Though I would say for the most part, they're probably not very connected to it. They probably just have a respect for their culture and history, just like how someone would have interest in human culture and history. But of course, there are Spartans like Vale, who taught herself the Sangheli language at a young age, and then went on to become a xenoanthropologist out of a genuine fascination with their species' culture and history. There has also been the recent addition of the first Vanguard armor set that is said to be specifically for Spartans who have been adopted into a Sangheli clan and worn by those who, while very unlikely, have risen to the rank of Khaidon. This armor is also said to be cast with the soils from that Khaidon's lands, so assuming this has actually happened, there is at least one Spartan who has entirely embraced Sangheli culture to the point of earning a leadership role. Our next question comes from Aquafire Unknown, who asked, why did 343 decanonize the Autojacker? I don't really have an answer for you, but I do have a question. Was it ever canon? Good God. If you can provide me an instance of where the Autojacker was 100% said to be canon, I will cover that in the video, all right? Next question here comes from rollpoke-v-viv, which I'm assuming is Roman numerals, but your question was, what is the Flood's end goal? Do they just keep assimilating until nothing is left and then starve? So the end goal of the Flood is something in line with what the Gravemind has said before, the complete assimilation of all life in the galaxy. And that's because this cosmic consciousness has preached to us time and time again that true peace and an end to conflict is only achievable through the complete unification of all life. That's their end goal, complete victory in a sense. Now, to achieve that end goal, they do literally have to consume all life in the galaxy, which for all intents and purposes means literally consuming all biomass until there is nothing left. And like you say, that would mean that they would eventually starve, but the question is, does the collective Flood consciousness realize that there is such a huge flaw in their plan? Well, you'd have to think they do, because the Flood consciousness is composed of trillions of consciousnesses, and one would have certainly thought about this or thought this to themselves at some point. But I think honestly, it probably just doesn't care. The Flood is probably viewing their complete assimilation of life and inevitable death afterwards as the necessary sacrifice to allow the galaxy, and by extension universe, to heal or reset. And maybe once the board is set clean, the Flood will willingly allow itself to fade from existence, disassembling itself into the basest biological components to reseed the galaxy's worlds with the building blocks for new life to emerge. Or alternatively, it will find some way to keep itself alive by creating some sort of self-sustaining cycle that allows uninfected organisms to live as a food source or otherwise. Either way, I think the Flood is totally aware of what their end goal means for their continued existence, and again, they just probably don't care. This next question here comes from Constantine8282, who asked, what are your opinions on Spartan Locke, and would you like to see him return in a future project? I have mixed feelings, but starting at the beginning, I think that the Halo Nightfall film or series was actually a cool way to introduce him as this Oni operative who was clever, dangerous, had a strong presence, and had what it takes to go up against alien foes in the post-war era. But when it comes to Halo 5, I felt that he and Fireteam Osiris were super shoehorned in, and because his story took precedence over Master Chief's in a mainline game, in my opinion, his character was sort of set up for failure. And the whole Hunt the Truth marketing scheme, which was said by many to be super misleading and portrayed him like an antagonist, also didn't do him any favors. And when you consider the fact he killed Jewel Andama in like 2 seconds and then went toe-to-toe with Chief and got a good hit on him, I think we all just couldn't stand him. But from the lore perspective, he is actually supposed to be this super lethal dude, capable of doing things like we see him do. And when it comes to the Spartan 4s, specifically in the newer gens of Mjolnir armor, they're all pretty much on the same playing field with Spartan 2s. So despite all of the bad blood, I can't really fault his character for using his tools well. He did also sort of redeem himself by helping out Blue Team at the end of the game, but after this, Fireteam Osiris just disbanded, and whether or not he was a casualty of the Banished attack on the Infinity has not been confirmed or denied, so it kinda just feels like his character was in limbo. At the very least, there is technically evidence to show that he might have been present and might have fought against Hyperius and lost his helmet, but again, nothing has been confirmed as that came from a cut piece of dialogue from Halo Infinite. But I think a cool way of reintroducing him would be to have him as one of the Spartan 4s helping defend a UNSC stronghold somewhere on Zeta Halo. Maybe his armor has fallen into disrepair like we would have assumed, and he's just scraping by with the rest of the survivors. I don't know, but to answer your question, I've never really been his biggest fan, and like I said, I kind of have mixed feelings, but I hope that he isn't just forgotten or killed off screen. In fact, I hope he does make a return in the next game, whether that be through some audio logs or an actual on-screen appearance. Alright, and we've come to our final question, which is from Wii I think, who asked, do you like Halo 4 Forward Unto Dawn? I absolutely love Forward Unto Dawn, and I think it's probably one of the best pieces of live-action Halo media that has been produced. And technically, there's not a lot to choose from, but I would definitely say it's up there for me with the Believe campaign and Neil Blomkamp's Halo Landfall. And outside of its stellar costuming, props, and the obvious marketing tie-ins to Halo 4, it was just a great portrayal of the universe told from the perspective of a character who was not the Master Chief. In fact, I think if they ever try to do another go at a Halo TV show or a proper feature-length film and don't intend to make Master Chief the primary focus, this would be a great example on what they could do. I loved the way they introduced the Spartan hero, the end-of-the-world level threat of the Covenant, and that sense of fear that we saw from the point of unaugmented humans. They were all just done so well. I was actually planning on covering the film here in the next few months, but if you somehow still haven't seen it by 2026, I highly recommend you carve out some time to go watch it. I even think it's still free to watch on YouTube Movies and TV, so if you want to do yourself a favor, go watch it ASAP. You will not be disappointed. Alright guys, I'm going to go ahead and cut it off there because this video is already 3 months late, and if I wait any longer to release it, I think it's going to be time to thank you all for the next big milestone. So again, thank you all so much for 15,000 subscribers and all of your support here on the channel over the years. And of course, if you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe if you're new and want to help me continue to grow. I think my goal for the 2026 year is to hit 20,000 subscribers, so I would really appreciate all of your help in getting there. And honestly, this was kind of fun. You know, there were some solid questions, a couple funny ones, and plenty that I didn't have the chance to cover, but I really enjoyed getting the chance to do a video. It was a little bit more about my feelings and less of that super to-the-point style that I normally have. And that's not going anywhere, but as I branch out into other forms of content, maybe do a little bit of gameplay stuff or do more of these Ask Me Anything videos like this, you may start to see me putting more of myself out there. But like I said, that's all for today, so I will see you in the next video.